Every Resident Evil final boss owes a debt to one creature. One experiment that proved Umbrella's entire philosophy could actually work. From a clawed monstrosity in a basement lab to mutating horrors that just won't stay dead, the template for what a final boss looks like traces straight back to what we're about to talk about. So let's start at the very beginning. Tyrant, T-002. Before May 1998, Umbrella had a problem. They could infect people. They could mutate people. They could turn people into shambling, bite-happy nightmares. What they couldn't do was make something that could actually think. Hunters were effective, sure, but try giving a hunter a complex tactical objective. You'd have better luck teaching a golden retriever to file your taxes. The T-002 changed everything. This was the first successful product of the Tyrant project, and what made it special wasn't its claws or its exposed heart, it was its brain. The T-002 retained near-human intelligence after infection. It could process commands, evaluate threats, and make strategic decisions in real time. This wasn't a monster. This was a soldier. In the original 1996 game, the T-002 has 220 HP in its standard form and 600 HP as the Super Tyrant. Respectable for the era, then the 2002 remake rolls around, and those values get a significant bump. The original wanted you to survive, the remake wanted you to suffer. But the moment that really defined the T-002 was the helipad. When ST-ARS tries to escape the Arklay laboratory, this thing smashes through concrete to chase them outside. It breaks the environment to get to you. No Resident Evil enemy had ever done that before. The arena wasn't safe. The walls weren't safe. The concept of, I made it to the exit wasn't safe. And here's what nobody talks about. Had the T-002 survived longer, its strategic thinking would have fundamentally changed bioweapon deployment. Umbrella wasn't building a creature to release into a city and hope for the best. They were building something you could point at a target and say, go. That's not a virus outbreak. That's a military asset. The T-002 died on that helipad, courtesy of a rocket launcher and some very motivated cops. But the idea behind it lived on as the blueprint. It established what a Resident Evil final boss is supposed to be. Something that thinks. Something that evolves. Something that chases you into spaces you thought were safe. And the very next one on that list didn't just evolve once. It evolved 5 times, each form worse than the last. William Birkin. The Tyrant was Umbrella's proudest achievement, a controlled, symmetrical, obedient weapon. William Birkin looked at that and said, I can do better, and then proceeded to do something so much worse that it redefined what a Resident Evil final boss could be. Birkin isolated the G-Virus back in 1988 at Arklay Laboratory, and the thing that makes it fundamentally different from the T-Virus is that it doesn't care about control. The T-Virus creates weapons, the G-Virus creates evolution. Uncontrolled, asymmetrical, ugly evolution that doesn't stop just because you shot the thing carrying it. Birkin injects himself after getting gunned down by Umbrella's own retrieval team, and from that moment on, he stops being a person and starts being a problem that keeps getting bigger. 5 distinct mutation stages, G1 through G5, each one more powerful and more horrifying than the last, and none of them look like they belong on the same creature. G1 still has Birkin's lab coat hanging off one shoulder like he's running late for a meeting. By G5, he's a shapeless mass of teeth and tissue that barely fits in the train car you're fighting him in. The asymmetry is the key here. The Tyrant looked designed. Birkin looks like something went catastrophically wrong at a cellular level, because it did. Here's what really separates him from everything that came before. You can't kill him, not really. Destroy most of his body and the G-Virus just triggers a stronger mutation. Blow off an arm, he grows 3. Collapse his torso, he becomes something that doesn't need a torso anymore. In the RE2 remake, this guy kills a T-00 Tyrant with a single blow. The same type of enemy that spent the entire game being an unstoppable threat to you gets swatted like a fly. That's not a subtle power scaling moment. That's Capcom telling you the rules have changed, and G3 is where most players hit the wall. The community has debated this for years, but the general consensus is that the third form is the peak difficulty spike. Fast, aggressive, and strong enough to end a run in seconds if you're not ready. But even beyond the fight itself, there's the embryo problem. The G-Virus doesn't just mutate its host. It can implant embryos into other people. If the host is genetically compatible, you get another G-mutant. If they're not, you get something arguably worse. Birkin isn't just a monster. He's a delivery system for making more monsters. The Tyrant was a finished product. Birkin is a process that never finishes. And that idea, a boss that evolves past death, that gets stronger every time you think you've won, changed what Resident Evil bosses could be. But if you think an enemy that won't stay dead is scary, wait until you meet one that won't stop following you. Nemesis T-Type. Every Tyrant up to this point had the same fundamental problem. You could hurt them, mutate them, blow them up on a helipad, and they'd stay down eventually. Umbrella looked at that track record and asked a question that should have never been asked. What if we made one that could think? The Nemesis T-Type starts its life as a standard T-103 Tyrant, big, strong, durable, dumb. Then Umbrella's European branch takes that body and surgically implants an NE alpha parasite directly into it. The parasite burrows into the host's brain, hijacking neural pathways and rebuilding cognitive function from the ground up. Most subjects rejected the parasite violently. The ones that didn't came out the other side with something no bioweapon had ever possessed before. It's genuine intelligence and self-awareness. Let that sink in for a second. This isn't a monster following a program. This is a monster that understands what it's doing, why it's doing it, and how to do it better next time. Umbrella nicknamed it the Pursuer, which is honestly underselling it. Nemesis was deployed to Raccoon City with a single objective: eliminate the remaining STARS members. It could lift concrete walls out of its path. It carried a rocket launcher in one hand, like a pool noodle. Later it picked up a flamethrower because apparently the rocket launcher wasn't enough personality. But the real terror wasn't the firepower. It was the fact that Nemesis learned. If you ran, it adapted its pursuit route. If you fought back, it adjusted its approach. Every encounter made it smarter. Every strategy you used had diminishing returns. This was the first time a Resident Evil boss felt like it was actively studying you, and the entire stalker boss archetype in horror games traces directly back to this thing. Here's where the original and the remake split in fascinating ways. The 1999 Nemesis was terrifying because of what it represented. You'd hear STARS growled from somewhere off screen and your stomach would drop. But mechanically, it was still a product of its era. The 2020 remake turned Nemesis into something genuinely unhinged. This version runs on walls. It climbs buildings on all fours like some kind of nightmare spider. After enough damage triggers further mutation, it starts spitting corrosive acid that melts through cover. Capcom redesigned the encounters so Nemesis functioned as both an unkillable pursuer in scripted chase sequences and a defeatable boss across multiple stage fights. You got the fantasy of being hunted by something unstoppable and the satisfaction of actually putting it down temporarily before it dragged itself back together and came at you worse than before. The NE alpha implantation process is the part that sticks with me. Umbrella wasn't enhancing a weapon. They were performing brain surgery on a corpse to give it a mind, then pointing that mind at people and telling it to hunt, which is, you know, not ideal. But if Nemesis represented the peak of what Umbrella could achieve by forcing intelligence into a monster, the next entry on our list took the opposite approach entirely. What happens when a genius willingly turns herself into one? Alexia Ashford. Every villain we've talked about so far has one thing in common. They didn't choose this. The Tyrant was a lab experiment. Birkin injected himself in a panic. Nemesis was a parasite shoved into a body that never asked for it. Alexia Ashford looked at the entire history of bioweapon research, decided everyone before her was an amateur, and then spent 15 years in a freezer to prove it. Let me explain. Alexia was born in 1971 as a clone of Veronica Ashford through a project literally named after her ancestor, Project Code Veronica. She was a genius. Not in the vague, oh, she's really smart way that games love to tell you without showing you. She created an entirely new virus strain, the T Veronica virus, that solved the single biggest problem in bioweapon development up to that point. Here's the thing. Every virus before hers destroyed the host's mind. The T-virus turned people into zombies. The G-virus turned Birkin into a shambling meat tower that forgot he had a daughter. Umbrella's entire research history was basically, we can make you incredibly powerful, but you'll have the cognitive function of a refrigerator. Alexia's T Veronica virus allowed the host to retain full human consciousness during mutation. That's not an incremental improvement. That's rewriting the rules entirely. But she knew the virus needed time to properly bond with a host. Rush the process, and you lose your mind like everyone else. So she injected herself with the virus, climbed into a cryogenic pod, and waited for 15 years. She was 12 years old when she went under. A 12-year-old had enough confidence in her own research, put herself into stasis for a decade and a half, trusting that the slow infection rate would let her body adapt without losing a single shred of who she was, and she was right. When she finally wakes up in Code, Veronica, she fights across 3 distinct boss forms. Her first form is manageable, her third form is spectacle, but her second form, that's the one the community still talks about. It's widely considered one of the most punishing encounters in the entire franchise. She spawns additional enemies during tentacle attacks, forcing you to manage crowd control while landing grenade launcher rounds on her upper body. You need roughly 5 to 6 direct hits just to trigger the transition to her final phase, and every single one has to be earned while she's actively trying to end you from multiple angles. The strategy discussions around this fight read like war plans. Which weapons to save, when to prioritize spawns versus focusing damage, how to position yourself so the tentacles don't corner you against a wall, and that's what makes Alexia uniquely terrifying. She's not a tragedy, she's not an accident. She's a scientist who engineered her own evolution with absolute precision, waited patiently for over a decade, and emerged exactly as powerful as she calculated she would be. Every other villain in this series became a monster because something went wrong. Alexia became a monster because everything went right. But if Alexia represents the pinnacle of calculated self-transformation, the next villain took a completely different approach to control. One that didn't require changing yourself at all, just putting something inside everyone else. Ursus Moon Saddler. Every boss we've talked about so far has one thing in common. The T-Virus, the G-Virus, T-Veronica, they all ask the same basic question. What happens when you mutate a human body beyond recognition? Osmond Saddler looked at that question and said, why would I destroy the body when I can just steal the mind? And that single shift in philosophy changed Resident Evil forever. Saddler was the leader of Los Illuminados, a neo-pagan cult operating as a full paramilitary organization deep in rural Spain, but calling him a cult leader undersells it. The man was a bioweapons research chief who figured out how to weaponize Las Plagas, ancient parasites that could burrow into a human host, hijack their nervous system, and turn them into obedient soldiers. Not mindless zombies stumbling into walls. Functional, coordinated, physically capable soldiers who just happen to have zero free will anymore. That's the part that makes Saddler genuinely terrifying on a conceptual level. Every previous bioweapon in this franchise traded humanity for power. You inject the virus, you lose your mind, you become a monster. Saddler's Plagas didn't do that. They kept the lights on, your body still works, your muscles still function, you can still hold a weapon, follow orders, operate in groups. You just don't get to decide any of it. The parasite decides. Saddler decides. He wasn't trying to create monsters, he was trying to create slaves. And he nearly pulled it off on a global scale, starting with the kidnapping of Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, in 2004. The USS TRA-TCOM mission to rescue her is the entire plot of Resident Evil 4, and it culminates in one of the most visually absurd final boss transformations the series has ever produced. Saddler's human form splits apart into this grotesque, multi-limbed spider creature covered in exposed eyeballs, each one serving as a vulnerable weak point you need to target. It's massive, it's disgusting, it's pure spectacle, and that's exactly the point. This fight isn't designed to scare you, it's designed to thrill you. RE4 reinvented the franchise as action horror, and Saddler's boss encounter is the thesis statement of that reinvention. Gone is the claustrophobic dread of a narrow hallway with something terrible at the end of it. Instead, you're on an open platform, dodging giant limbs, shooting glowing eyeballs, and feeling like an action hero the entire time. The community has debated for years whether this fight is actually too easy, largely because Ada tosses you a rocket launcher near the end that can one-shot Saddler into oblivion, which is, you know, not ideal for dramatic tension. But honestly, it's become such a beloved meme at this point that complaining about it feels wrong. The rocket launcher is the Saddler fight for most people. You aim it, you fire it, you watch the man explode. Cinema. But the real legacy of Saddler isn't the fight itself. It's what the Plagas represented for the series going forward. An entirely new category of bioweapon threat. Not mutation, control. Not destroying populations, but subjugating them. That concept would echo through every Resident Evil game that followed. And it started right here, with a cult leader in a silly robe who figured out that the scariest thing you can do to a person isn't turning them into a monster. It's leaving them exactly as they are, and taking away the one thing that made them human. But if Saddler changed the game, next boss on our list perfected it, because nobody in Resident Evil history played the long game quite like Albert Wesker. Albert Wesker. Every franchise has that one villain. The guy who shows up in the first game, sticks around for a decade, and becomes so synonymous with the series that killing him off feels like ending an era. For Resident Evil, that's Albert Wesker. And his final boss fight in RE5 is exactly as ridiculous as he deserves. Before we get to the volcano, because yes, we are absolutely getting to the volcano, let's talk about what made Wesker so dangerous. The prototype virus gave him superhuman strength, speed, and reflexes that bordered on cartoonish. This is a man who could intercept a missile mid-flight and throw it back with one hand. His reaction time was so absurdly fast that bullets at close range simply did not connect because he'd already moved. And then there were the eyes. Slit-shaped pupils with a yellow to red hue that literally glowed when he got emotional. The man's eyeballs had mood lighting, which is, you know, not ideal for poker night. But here's the thing about Wesker's power. It came with a kill switch. He required regular injections of a serum called PG67A/W to keep the prototype virus stable. Miss a dose and things fall apart. Take too much and it acts as a poison. His greatest weapon had an expiration date stapled to it. Wesker spent years positioning himself as a god among men, a being who had transcended human limitations through viral engineering. But underneath all that superhuman swagger, he was a guy who needed his medicine on schedule or he'd die. There's something beautifully pathetic about that. Then comes the Ouroboros virus. Wesker, the man who spent his entire career obsessing over human evolution, infects himself with Ouroboros. The result is grotesque. Massive tentacle mutations erupting from pustules in his chest, his body twisting into something that barely resembles the slick, sunglasses-wearing villain we'd known for years. The tentacles gave him devastating reach and strength, but those exposed pustule centers were fatal weak points. Stab them and he crumbles. The man who wanted to be the next stage of human evolution got exactly what he asked for, and it was the ugliest, most self-defeating transformation imaginable. He didn't ascend. He collapsed inward, and then we need to talk about how he actually dies, because it's genuinely one of the most gloriously absurd moments in gaming history. Chris and Sheva are fighting Ouroboros Wesker inside an active volcano. He falls into the lava. They stab him repeatedly in his chest pustules, and then, just to make absolutely sure, they fire 2 RPGs directly into his face while he's sinking into molten rock. Hey Chris, you think he's dead? I don't know, Sheva. We only shot him with 2 rocket launchers inside a volcano. Better check. The volcano death generates passionate debate among fans, and both sides have a point. On one hand, it's the most over-the-top action movie nonsense the series has ever produced. On the other hand, this is Albert Wesker, the man who dodged bullets for fun and punched boulders for cardio. A volcano is exactly the level of excess his character demands. No other final boss on this list carried this kind of narrative weight. Wesker wasn't some monster you met 2 hours ago. He was the villain from the original game, the betrayer, the shadow hanging over the entire franchise for over a decade. Killing him meant closing a chapter that started in 1996. But if you think Wesker's send-off was divisive, wait until you see what Resident Evil 6 decided to pit Chris against. HAOS. On paper, House is the single most dangerous thing the Resident Evil franchise has ever produced. Not Wesker, not Nemesis, not any of the tyrants or G-virus mutations or parasitic cults. A translucent, self-replicating organism designed to end human civilization in a matter of days. And somehow, nobody remembers fighting it. Let me explain. HAOS was created by Carla Radames using C-virus combined with microbes extracted from deep sea magma. Already that sentence sounds like someone threw darts at a board of sci-fi buzzwords, but it gets worse. The entire purpose of this thing was to serve as the ultimate BOW, a living pandemic delivery system capable of spreading the C-virus across the entire planet. Not a city, not a country, the planet. Within days of being released, every human being on Earth would be exposed. That's the pitch. That's what Chris Redfield walks into at the end of his campaign in Resident Evil 6. And visually, House actually delivers. The design is genuinely unsettling. It has translucent skin stretched over a humanoid frame, so you can see the bone structures and internal organs shifting underneath, like some kind of deep-sea nightmare wearing a person as a costume. It possesses a healing factor that lets it recover from damage that would obliterate anything else in the series. It can form chrysalid cocoons to adapt to different environments, essentially rebuilding itself on the fly. And the gas it produces transforms humans into zombies on contact. No injection needed. No parasites. Just breathe near it and you're done. So we're talking about a creature that can heal itself, reshape itself, and passively convert every living person within breathing distance into a zombie. A self-replicating extinction event with see-through skin. Hey Dimitri, what's the plan for Tuesday? Oh, you know, end all human life on Earth. Maybe grab lunch. Here's where the disconnect hits. Despite all of that, the actual boss fight is one of the most forgettable encounters in the entire franchise. The lore says this thing could wipe out civilization. The gameplay says it's a big squishy target in an underwater facility that you punch and shoot until it falls over. The mechanical difficulty never once matches the apocalyptic threat level that every document and cutscene spent hours establishing. You fight it, it dies. And most players walked away thinking, that was it? And that's the real tragedy of House. It represents Resident Evil 6 swinging for the absolute fences in terms of narrative scale. Global extinction, the end of the human race. A bioweapon so powerful that nothing before or after it in the series timeline even comes close. close. But RE6's divisive design philosophy meant the encounter couldn't land the way it deserved. The game was already pulling players in 4 different campaign directions, drowning in action set pieces, and by the time you reached House, the fatigue had set in. You were fighting the most dangerous organism in Resident Evil history, and it felt like just another thing to shoot at. It's a shame, honestly. The translucent skin design alone deserved a better showcase. A creature you can literally see the guts of, healing in real time, generating zombie gas just by existing. That's horror. That's the kind of thing that should have players pausing to collect themselves. Instead, it got buried under RE6's identity crisis, and the community's consensus has been pretty consistent ever since. Cool concept, cool design, underwhelming execution, which is, not ideal when your bioweapon's whole thing is ending the world. But if you think a walking extinction event with forgettable gameplay is a letdown, wait until you meet the bioweapon that skips the fighting entirely and just crawls inside your head. Eveline. Every final boss in Resident Evil up to this point had one thing in common. They were big, massive, mutated, grotesque things designed to rip you apart with claws or tentacles or whatever nightmare appendage the virus decided to grow that day. Eveline is a little girl, and she's arguably the most disturbing thing this franchise has ever produced. Codenamed E-001. Eveline was the first E-type bioweapon created by an organization called the Connections. Her entire design philosophy was built around a concept Resident Evil had never truly explored. What if a bioweapon didn't need to fight at all? No claws, no mutations. Eveline could control your mind. She could make you love her, obey her, kill for her, and you'd do it all with a smile because you genuinely believed it was your idea. She didn't destroy people's bodies. She destroyed who they were. Here's where it gets genuinely sad though. Eveline was created from a human embryo infected with mold, a fungal organism that gave her the ability to produce and spread infectious colonies just by existing. But the genetic modifications that made her powerful also made her age at 25 times the normal human rate. She needed constant medication just to stay stable. Without it, she'd deteriorate rapidly, her body breaking down while her mind stayed sharp enough to understand exactly what was happening to her. She was a weapon with an expiration date, and she knew it. And what did this dying, accelerating child want more than anything? A family. That's it. The entire Baker House incident, all those murders, all that horror across 3 years in a Louisiana swamp happened because a lonely little girl wanted a mom and a dad. She infected the Bakers not out of malice, but out of desperation. She made them love her because nobody else would. Be my family. That's all she ever asked. Which is, not ideal when the asking involves parasitic mind control and turning people into mold creatures. This is what makes Eveline the anti-House. Chaos was a building-sized apocalypse weapon with zero personality. Eveline was a small, fragile child with more emotional complexity than half the human villains in this series combined. She's scary precisely because you understand her. You feel bad for her. And then you remember she psychologically enslaved an entire family and murdered anyone who wandered too close, and you feel bad about feeling bad. By the time Ethan Winters reaches her in 2017, Eveline's rapid aging has caught up completely. She's no longer a child. She's an elderly woman in a wheelchair, her body ravaged by decades of deterioration, compressed into 3 years. The E-necrotoxin destabilizes her and she merges with the surrounding mold to form a massive creature for the final confrontation, and then you kill her in about 2 minutes. The Eveline boss fight is a letdown. After an entire game of atmospheric dread and genuinely unsettling encounters with the Baker family, the final battle amounts to pumping rounds into a big mold face while the game hands you increasingly powerful weapons. The build-up deserved a climax that matched its intensity, and instead, you get a shooting gallery. Narratively, Eveline is one of the strongest final bosses in the franchise. Mechanically, she might be the weakest. But that narrative weight matters. Resident Evil 7 pulled this series back from the brink after RE6, tried to turn survival horror into an action movie. Eveline was the statement of intent. No more punching boulders and volcanoes, just a scared, dying child in a rotting house who could make you lose your mind. Sometimes the smallest monsters are the hardest to forget, but if Eveline wanted a mother, she should be careful what she wishes for, because the woman who inspired her creation is infinitely worse. Mother Miranda. Every final boss on this list was created by science. Mother Miranda was created by loss. Born in the late 19th century in a remote remote Eastern European mountain village, Miranda lived a quiet, unremarkable life until 1909, when she gave birth to a daughter named Eva. For 10 years, Eva was everything. And then in August of 1919, the Spanish flu took her. Just like that. A mother holding a dead child in a village with no answers and no hope. Here's where it gets dark. After Eva's death, Miranda discovered something buried deep beneath the village. A fungal organism called the mold, ancient and impossibly powerful. She didn't run from it. She walked straight into it. The mold infected her, rewrote her biology, and gave her abilities that no human should have. Shape-shifting, regeneration, near immortality. And instead of using those powers to move on, to grieve, to heal, she made a decision that would define the next century of that village's existence. She was going to bring Eva back. For 102 years, from 1919 to 2021, Mother Miranda ruled that village like a god. She experimented on generations of people, families, children, entire bloodlines twisted and discarded because they weren't compatible enough to serve as a vessel for her daughter's consciousness. She created the Cadu parasite. She built the Four Lords, Dimitrescu, Heisenberg, Moreau, Donna Beneviento, all of them products of her experiments, all of them tools in service of one goal. Every horror in that village traces back to a single mother who could not let go. She also mentored a young researcher named Oswell Spencer. That name should ring a bell. Spencer went on to co-found Umbrella Corporation. The entire pharmaceutical nightmare that launched this franchise can be traced back to Miranda's research. Let that sink in for a second. And then in February of 2021, she found what she believed was the perfect vessel, Rosemary Winters, an infant, the daughter of Ethan and Mia Winters. Miranda abducted Rose, impersonated Mia, infiltrated the Winters household, and set the entire nightmare of Resident Evil Village into motion, all for a baby she believed could hold Eva's soul. The final fight against Miranda is the series at its most mechanically evolved. She shifts between combat forms, spider, bird, human, each one requiring different tactics and spacing. It's fast, it's aggressive, and it's visually unlike anything the franchise had done before. In a way, those transformations are the entire history of Resident Evil boss design compressed into a single encounter. The raw physicality of the Tyrant, the multi-stage evolution of Birkin, the relentless pursuit energy of Nemesis, the intelligence of Wesker, all of it filtered through a century of mold infection and maternal desperation. Ethan Winters killed her on February 10th, 2021, but even death didn't fully end her story. In the Shadows of Rose DLC, set in 2037, Miranda's spiritual presence appears within the mold's consciousness, suggesting that 16 years after her physical death, her influence still lingers. Which is, not ideal. But here's the thing about Miranda that separates her from every other name on this list. The Tyrant was a weapon, Birkin was a scientist who panicked, Nemesis was a programmed hunter, Sadler wanted power, Wesker wanted godhood, House was a doomsday device, Eveline wanted a family she was never given, Miranda had a family, she lost it, and she spent 102 years torturing an entire village because she couldn't accept that loss. That's what makes her the perfect final entry in 25 years of Resident Evil final bosses. The franchise started with a mindless bioweapon breaking out of a tube, and it arrived at a grieving mother who chose to become a monster rather than bury her daughter. Every boss between those 2 points represents a step on that evolutionary ladder, from pure body horror to something far more unsettling, a villain you understand, a villain whose motivation isn't world domination or corporate greed or scientific ambition, but the single most human emotion imaginable. She wanted her child back, and she burned the world trying. Not all stories have a point, but this one does. The scariest monsters in Resident Evil were never the ones with claws and tentacles. They were the ones with reasons. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.